Coming up next on Another View, a history lesson on the making of America. The year was 1619, and 3 events involving race, gender, and government happened that would shape the beginning of this country and change the colony of Virginia forever. So what were the events, and how and why are they relevant today? Why is there a 2-day conference discussing this time in history? Why should we care about the year 1619? Historians Dr. Linda Heywood and Dr. John Thornton of Boston University, along with Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander of Norfolk State University, have the answers. It's an Another View history lesson right after this news from NPR.
Discussing the issues and celebrating the successes of the African American community. This is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Norfolk State University's History Department is hosting a 2-day conference called 1619, The Making of America. The conference is today and tomorrow on the campus of NSU, and for history lovers, it's a really big deal. The year 1619 was a pivotal one in terms of how this country began, and because of events involving race, gender, and government, the then colony of Virginia changed drastically from a small white male-dominated settlement to one that included white and black families and, along with Native Americans, created America. My guests today are experts on the year 1619. Please welcome Dr. Linda Heywood, professor of history at Boston University. Hello, Dr. Heywood. How are you?
Hi, fine.
Good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Dr. John Thornton, professor of history also at Boston University. Hello, Dr. Thornton.
Hi, how are you?
Glad to have you. And our very own Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, professor of history at Norfolk State University. Hello, Cassandra. How are you?
Just fine, Barbara. Thank you for having us on your show.
And just so that our audience knows, I've asked all 3 of our guests if they minded if we stayed on a first-name basis, and they were all completely fine with that. So while I will mention their names, if you hear me call them by their first name, I am not being disrespectful. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay. Before we get into the actual events of 1619, Cassandra, tell us why the conference? Why now? Why this push to understand 1619?
Well, starting with the 2007 conference on Jamestown, there were a number of us who were involved in talking about the upcoming 2019 program. And there's a group in Hampton, or they're based in Hampton, and they're called the 1619 Project Incorporated. They started a community-based program, and I said, it's time for the academic community to get together and to begin the conversation, bringing in scholars who've done work on this particular topic, because we're not that far from 2019. Mm-hmm. And so the idea was really germinated there, and I thought this is the time period. 2012, we need to start moving forward. This is a critical election year, and so what better time than to talk about something that was of critical importance to American society, and that is 1619. And the whole idea is that it's not until then that we begin to see the elements of what would make up America begin to form. Yes, 1607 was the official beginning, but it really wasn't until 1619 that we start to see the threads coming together that would build up America. And so the purpose of this conference is to kind of lay that groundwork for the discussion that will continue through 2019.
Now, you all are on campus right now. I want to let our audience know you're not here in the studio with me today, but you're actually on campus because the conference is going on as we speak. So, Cassandra, could you give us just a little quick overview of what someone could expect from the conference, and can they still join?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we started this morning. Registration for both days begins at 8. We're encouraging young people especially to come. They can get student passes so that they can come and join the conversation. The fee is really just taking care of the food because we want to hold people hostage the entire day to make sure they participate in our discussion. And really what it does is it provides a real sense of community as we have this whole day conversation. It will go until 5 p.m. today, and it starts again tomorrow the same time at 8 a.m. The opening session is at 9. And throughout each day, what we have is a morning, a lunchtime, and an afternoon presentation by our scholars. And then we have, in between that time, a morning and an afternoon roundtable session where other scholars are having a conversation with everyone in the room about various topics. And so we have one on creolization. We have one on how we remember that spirit voice. We have another one talking about the larger connections, that's part of the Columbian exchange. That 1619 doesn't just represent a moment in time for American society. It represents what is also happening throughout the world. Okay. And we have, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
We have another session that's looking at the American Indian and how 1619 really began to transform their world as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into what was going on in 1619. And Dr. John Thornton, I'm going to ask you to start by set the stage for us. What was happening in the colony of Virginia at that time, prior to 1619?
Right. Well, the colony of Virginia at that time was just barely getting started. I mean, we talk about 1607, but it was very touch and go for at least 3-4 years whether they would actually maintain a colony. It's always important to remember that we know about the colonies that were successful, but there were a lot of unsuccessful colonies as well. Sometimes they couldn't find a proper place to build their houses and settle. Sometimes they ran into hostility with indigenous people around them. Sometimes they ran into hostility from other European powers. And one way or another, we saw in this early 17th century period, especially, a lot of failed efforts. My favorite ones are the ones that try to settle on the coast of Guyana, where there were 15 or 20 different unsuccessful colonies from all different European countries that just didn't make it. Mm-hmm. And so our Virginia colony needs to be put in that context. They were very worried that the Spanish were going to come up and get them. One of the reasons that Jamestown has so many weapons is not so much they were afraid of the Powhatans as they were afraid of the Spanish. And the Spanish, we've read the Spanish reports on this too. They were well aware of it, and they were aware that this was likely, in their opinion, to become a pirate base or a privateering base, depending on your perspective, to attack Spanish shipping. That had been going on. English had been doing that for a good 20, 30 years before. And now the English were building bases in America. And I think Jamestown needs to be put as a sort of an advanced base as a part of the 30 Years' War, in which the English were trying to pillage as much as they could get from the Spanish or the Portuguese who were allied with them. And this was going to be the base of operations. It's not what we expect when they finally hit upon tobacco and made this a payable place. That tobacco paid for that military establishment.
But go ahead. But Dr. Heywood, the life at that point, then, though, first of all, it was predominantly male. It was pretty rough in terms of disease and the weather and all kinds of things. This was not just a thriving colony.
Well, but it's a colony that survived, and that's the thing that we from the African side, we look at how Africans coming into this world were one of the variables that, in fact, allowed the colony to eventually survive, sustain itself to be the most, in terms of population, that's the demography, in terms of wealth, and in terms of the aspirations of the colonists who came over, because they came over to build a plantation. And in those years, plantation meant a successful venture, which would pay off.
So in 1619, then, the first 20 Africans landed in Hampton. They weren't intending to come to America, though. Can you tell us what was going on and how they wound up here?
Well, Dr. John will start that, and then I'll come in.
Okay.
Okay, well, first of all, we have to recognize that this is not the beginning of the slave trade. It may be an early phase in the English involvement in it, but it's not the beginning. The slave trade began in the late 15th century, even before America was discovered. And the Portuguese, in particular, had taken a great advantage, a great lead in this. And so they were busy acquiring slaves all through the 16th century. A real turning point for them was when they founded the colony of Angola on the coast of West Central Africa in 1575. There they were able to engage directly in warfare against African kingdoms and capture literally tens of thousands of people every year. And so it was from that flow of slaves brought both to the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, but also by contract to the Spanish colonies all throughout Central America and even in North America and Mexico. And that's what the English pirates, privateers, that brought the Africans to this place, that's what they were tapping. They were attacking those ships. They were carrying people from them, sometimes the whole ship, but frequently just taking as many as they could haul off and bringing them to their own colonies. And that's sort of the geopolitical background.
Well, we should note, however, that 1619 was not the first year in this long kind of a relationship that Africans had with Europeans in this case in the form of the Portuguese. That, in fact, when the Portuguese arrived in what is today the Zaire River or the Congo River, they met the African states that had been already in existence with centralized place, the city of Mbanza, Congo, the capital of the Kingdom of Congo. When one of the Portuguese sent back to said, look, it looks like our city in Evora. So they were comparing. They didn't see just the bush as we would think. They saw. Maybe we know that the Africans didn't build with the same materials that the Europeans built, but in terms of organization, structure, in terms of things like, making of wars, things like elite classes and classes that were, enslaved or classes who were free people, they found all of that in Africa. So the meetings that would eventually result in these Africans being the first to arrive, in Angolan Africans being the first to arrive in Virginia, begins in fact, the Portuguese presence in Angola in 1575, but before that, the Portuguese presence in the area of the Congo, which is today Democratic Republic of Congo, in fact, 1483, 1485, 1491, when the King of Congo voluntarily converted to Christianity.
So the slaves or the Africans, that came over in 1619, they had already been exposed to Christianity, correct?
That's correct. Depending on exactly where they were captured, some of them may have been captured in Congo. In fact, there was a civil war in Congo at the same year. They would have been Christians for 2 or 3 generations already. Many of them had Portuguese names. When we started going through the names of early Africans in the property lists and the patent documents, we saw a lot of people with names that were Portuguese names. That a lot of people historians thought until our work came out, these were Spanish names. And of course, that's pretty much the same, but it isn't. These weren't names that were given to them by Europeans. These were names they gave themselves, or they were given by their parents, or even names that honored their grandparents. One of these early Africans was a man named John Pedro. That second name is his father's name, and his father's name was Pedro, and he probably came from Congo.
So what we find, in fact, in looking at these names, what we try to say is that which of these names had, in fact, comparable equivalences in English. So if we see Pedro, we know that meant Peter. If we saw Maria, we know it meant, Mary. And in fact, if we saw, let's say, Elizabeth, that's not an Iberian name. And you do not see, in fact, you see Isabel. And we know that would mean Elizabeth. But these names that we saw in one of the earliest, documents, the Master Roll from 1625, had this person. It was the name of an Iberian name and it says Negro, and she comes where? What ship, right? She comes on the Treasurer. And we know the Treasurer ends up is one of the ships that, in fact, had captured the slaves from the Portuguese ship. Some of the slaves were deposited here or sold here in August, and then the others went to Bermuda, were taken to Bermuda, some of which came back in December, January period. So we really have very accurate information on the arrival and who these people were.
And who they were. Go ahead.
What we were able to do is, in our book, Central Africans, Atlantic Creoles, and the Making of the Americas, is that we tracked every war in Angola and in Congo Kingdom that was fought between the Portuguese and the Africans, and we tracked the extent to which interactions, whether cultural interactions, diplomatic relationships had been occurring between the Portuguese and the Africans in those areas. So there were greater densities of interaction in some areas where wars occur and lesser. So the cultural mix of that first set of Africans in 1619 would include some who were very familiar with Europeans in the form of the Portuguese, European ways, European naming, Christianity, others who would have come from areas that were not centrally involved in that process.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call. Give our experts a call if you're interested in talking about events in 1619 and how it changed and created the making of America. Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, so when these 20 Africans arrived and became a part of the colony, what were some of the cultural changes that started to happen?
One of the most important things that people bring with them are their memories and their practices, their cultural practices, how they view their world. So we're talking about the religious beliefs. We're talking about the way in which they prepare and even eat food, the way that they view social customs. And while these people who were coming in were unfree people, we know that some of them were able to acquire their own freedom and become freeholders, which means property owners in the colony. And they would begin to create their own world. Everyone knows the story of Anthony Johnson. In fact, most of your textbooks, especially those produced here in Virginia, always include a vignette about Anthony Johnson. He was a man who came here in the colony, I believe it was 1621. It took 30 years before he was able to get his freedom. When he did, he was given 250 acres of land on the eastern shore in Accomack County. And we know that his descendants would eventually purchase land and name it Angola. And so here you have someone whose family was actually, because he was able to marry, and he married a woman who came in. She came in as Maria, and she changed her name, or someone changed her name to Mary, and they had children. And so even though their children were born here in America, they represent this creolization that was happening among the Africans, that was even happening among the Europeans and the Native Americans, that they were adapting themselves to this new land as the Indians were adapting themselves to these interlopers, these individuals who either came in willingly or unwillingly to the land, and they were adapting the way that they viewed their world with what they had in front of them. But there were ways in which they remembered their world and ways in which they remembered even the gods that they worshipped. And they put that into it. In fact, Linda, in her presentation today, and she's going to talk about it tomorrow as well, she talked about the religion of Queen Nzinga and how she adapted her world to this new religion that she adopted, but still maintain certain principles and certain ideas and values of her original religious cultural beliefs.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, too, that was going on at the same time was, in terms of the colony, was this deliberate push to bring over marriageable women into the colony to help, I guess, keep it going. They felt that the men maybe would be more willing to stay and kind of tough it out if they brought over these marriageable women, as they called it. Dr. John Thornton, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, as what I said before was that these were originally conceived of as pretty much military outposts, and given that, they put obviously a virtually all-male force on the ground. And one of the things that the Virginia Company quickly realized was that this was going to be self-sustaining. They were going to have to develop a community that they could tap on to protect this territory, and they needed to have that community be anchored in the spot. The other thing they knew they needed to do was they needed to defray their costs, and that was, of course, going to be settled by the growing of tobacco. And the third thing they needed to have was they needed to form families. Now, they opted, and this is an important point, I think, they opted to decide to form their families out of European stock. And although there were certainly some marriages across the boundary between indigenous Americans and the English, the decision to bring in European women was, I think, maybe unconsciously a decision that they weren't going to be joining the indigenous community through marriage. They were going to be preserving a European community.
But yet the French and the Portuguese did actually intermarry with the Native Americans, didn't they?
Columbus ordered his people to marry with the indigenous people. Cortez ordered his people to marry the indigenous people. So it was different. They're very different strategies.
So why do you think the Europeans took the strategy that they did? Hello?
Well, it's not the Europeans, of course, it's the English.
And the English, I'm sorry.
Right.
I apologize. The English, why do you think they took that strategy as opposed to what the Portuguese and French did? I mean, I'm just trying to get to what was going on in the individual cultures that would make them do that.
Well, I think if we look at the different approaches to the English, some people would say the English are much more, for instance, take the case English, Irish, Scottish. In the documents that we have looked at, in those early 17th century documents of deeds and, laborers and so on, the English, the documents are very clear. You would see, if a name comes up, who the ethnic background of this person is. So he said Irishman, right? Sometimes we see Irishmen, there's 6 Irishmen. They're servants, right? Just no names. Scotsmen. We also see Negroes, right? Or we might see a John Pedro or Anthony. The English would name their own English person, the person that they consider the, English, by 2 names, Elizabeth or what. But, they were not, it wasn't just white and non-white. They were very focused on identifying the background of that person. And that person might be English, that person might be Scottish. They have Portugals, I've seen in the document, Portugal, they may have also other types of ethnicities. They always identified those ethnicities that made up. And this is all in Virginia.
Okay, so
if I can
go ahead.
Here. This is the difference between us and Brazil. We know from genetic research, for example, that when early in the study of genetic origins of people, a group at a hospital in Brazil decided to sample the white population of Brazil. These are people who identified themselves as white and were regarded as white. And yet they discovered that 2/3 of them had either indigenous or African ancestry. And this country, I would say that most people, not everybody as we know, but most people who identify themselves as white are indeed 100% of European origin. It's quite remarkable. We travel a lot in Brazil, we travel a lot in Angola, we travel a lot in Central America, and it's a very different attitude towards ancestry and race that the Spanish and the Portuguese brought here than what the English brought here. And it really does come back to that sort of basic idea. We're not going to marry the local people. We're going to keep them at arm's length. We're going to have our own.
We're going to stay within ourselves. If you're just joining us, we're talking about the events of 1619 and how they shaped America with historians Dr. Linda Heywood, Dr. Robert Thornton, and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. We invite you to join our conversation at 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. What are your questions about what America was like in the beginning, in the year 1619? Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, the third major thing in that year was the coming together of the House of Burgesses.
Oh, yes. It would be in 1619 that we would actually see the legislative body. It was a one house, what we call a unicameral house, that the governor, Sir Yeardley, created. He wanted the freeholders, those people who own land, to begin to make certain laws and policies. And this really shows us that they're moving. They're deciding to move from just being a fort or an outpost to an actual colony, because now they want to start governing themselves, and they want to at least have some kind of order, some kind of governmental structure that's similar to the one in England. And so this body, this group of men get together. They're all white men, and they get together and decide to lay out certain laws. And one of the first things they do is to validate the seizure of land that they've done with the military from the Indians. So they're now saying this land is legally ours. That's the first thing they do. And the second thing they do, which is equally important, is to declare that the Church of England is now the official church, because England had a state-established church. This is how they governed. This was the basis of their authority, using the political side and using the military, and more importantly, validating it with the religion. Saying, of course, that this is authorized by God, we're using the military to back up what we're saying, and we have a political structure. And so we would see this created in Virginia at that time. And they began to then establish what kind of relationship they were going to have with the Indians. How were they going to monitor their economy? How were they going to handle that? What were some of the trade relations that they were going to establish? And then they wanted to control things such as gambling. They wanted to control the kinds of relationships that would emerge within the actual structure of the colony. So how would people relate to each other? And then we would see the evolution of a court system. By 1643, and it's 42, 43, this is when you begin to see the charter laid out for what would be known as the House of Burgesses. And it would be that body that would eventually change the law and write into the law a declaration that all incoming Africans would be slaves.
I'm curious about that, because was there an event or something that kind of set the need to set that law? Because in the very beginning, if I'm understanding you correctly, the laws, as you said, the first thing they did was to say this is our land, and then to decide how they were going to deal with the Native Americans. But what changed the attitude that made the whole legal system in terms of what we now know as slavery?
Well, you're really, and I'm going to let the others chime in, but you're really dealing with a transformation that's global. And by global, in terms of where the Europeans were coming from and the kinds of economies that they were establishing. And this colony knew that in order to compete with especially the Latin American colonies, that they had to have a similar type of labor system. And so by the time we get to the 1660s, we're talking about Virginia now wanting to compete with the rest of the world with tobacco production, even though the others were primarily producing things such as sugarcane, but they wanted to be able to compete globally, and they could not do that. You think of Barbados with their tobacco production. They could not do that if the labor system was different. But I'm going to let our others to chime in.
Okay, Dr. Heywood, Linda?
What we have to know is that the English were very well aware that the Spanish and the Portuguese, right, had Africans as slaves. Now, we know that just from the terminology in Portuguese. The Portuguese identified those enslaved Africans who they had as slaves as Negro. Now, if we go to Brazil, we have the term negra da terra, which is Negro of the land. So those Native Americans who were enslaved by the Portuguese are called slaves of the land. The African slaves are called Negro. If you look at the document, the early documents, the deeds and so in Virginia, we would see that term Negro, for Negroes, or Angela, Negro. This is so what we have argued is that the English actually adopted the word Negro from the Portuguese and the Spanish usage of that word. Now, did they have a system of slavery officially in their legislation? As we've just not as yet. It will come into being. And what would make the status of those first Africans more officially slaves would be, in fact, laws that were passed which said that the status that they had as slaves was inheritable. That's the fundamental difference, and John could talk more about it.
Well, we often read that the first Africans brought here were held to be indentured servants. Strictly speaking, of course, that's certainly not true. Indentured servants who came over from England, they signed a contract. It specified how long they would serve. It specified what the terms of the ending of the contract would be, and so on. The Africans who were brought here, of course, didn't have any contract, and nobody would have thought to make a contract with them, and they certainly didn't make a contract after they arrived. However, that doesn't mean that at that particular point in time, they were considered to be lifelong inheritable slaves. The fact is, in English, in the early 17th century, people were routinely condemned by courts for periods of slavery, that's the term they use, which would be limited. So somebody would commit a crime, they'd say he would serve as a slave for 7 years. Somebody else might serve for 10 years. So joining the idea of perpetual inheritable servitude to the concept of slavery was actually something that happened in Virginia in the context of the African descended population. And it was, the roots of it were already there with the fact that they understood what the Portuguese did, that there weren't contracts, that very few of them did get freedom. We have examples from other colonies where people would sue for their freedom, and sometimes they'd be granted freedom just because they'd been held for a long time. Another complicating factor was that the church was itself at that time debating whether a Christian could be held as a slave. Now, I think until we've pointed out that many of these slaves would have, in fact, been Catholics, or at least Christians, for a good period of time, generations before they were brought to America, this must have been a factor as well. We know that in the Dutch colonies, they were concerned about this. Not everybody who came was a Christian, but enough came that it created a bit of a contrast, and so the courts had to decide how to rule on this.
And they said they were half free, so they gave them limited periods of service. Even after they were free, they still have to give some labor. That's in the Dutch colony, New Netherlands. In the English colony, you had a much more, before the laws took place, you had a much more fluid type of situation. So you can find, an Anthony Johnson, right, gaining his freedom, or John Pedro, or several others. In fact, we have an article on the roots in terms of, the ancestry of, President Obama that comes through not his father's side, but his mother's side, and goes back to Virginia, to an individual, John Punch, in Virginia, who, in fact, was one of those Africans who married or had a relationship with a white English servant, and the descendants of those increasingly became white. Well, not only maintained their freedom because they got that freedom from the mother, but they also, became white as well. And there are other cases of that happening. this situation, it was a very interesting fluid because the ingredients that would go to form what Ira Berlin calls your plantation society has not been in existence yet.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. David joins us from Chesapeake. Hi, David. You're on the air.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I wanted to add to the question you had asked about, what would be really the purpose of the English marrying into other, say the Native Americans or Indians and so forth. And a lot of that had to do with their English common law, and helped develop the naturalization, because by marrying someone in another country, it establish property rights. One of the things I guess I wanted to ask is, what is really the overall goal here of, because I've been doing research into this, it's a really good topic, it's very complicated, but I was just kind of wondering what the overall goal is here by, doing the mapping and, and tracing the whole history here. What is its real purpose? Because the more I look at this, and I've come up with some of the same things, but I know that Dr. Lewis Gates out of Harvard had gone to South America, I guess it was last year, and trying to kind of investigate some of the African linkages and heritage and so forth. And, he came up with a lot of resistance, and no one wants to really, especially South America, none of the countries really want to identify with any of it.
Well, actually, Dr. Thornton and Dr. Heywood also worked with Dr. Gates on the PBS programming, served as consultants to this. Let's let them answer his question, David's question of what's the purpose in looking for this and in discovering this. Let's start with you, Dr. Thornton.
Well, I know that Dr. Gates' intentions in this were to try to get people in America to recognize that there were African-descended people outside of the United States. I mean, it may sound strange to us, but many Americans are not fully aware. They might be aware of Caribbean people because of obvious features and so on, but they weren't aware, I think, nearly as much as people in other parts of South America. And what he also wanted to highlight was one of the things I talked about just a minute ago was the different way they perceive race in those areas. He was, I thought, very good in this program in pointing out, first of all, that they don't necessarily have this black-white dichotomy, and they recognize that there are people in between who have a status of their own. That's one part of it. But the other part of it is there's still a very significant component of racism within those communities, and it becomes more intense as one moves down the color scale from white to black. So that was his intentional in doing that, but he's very interested in the history of those things as well.
I think the issue of race was also part of the conversation, because if you go to a place like Dominican Republic, the differences between Dominican Republic and Haiti, the color of one's skin and the linking one's, color to some European ancestry, it's easier to do that, and people do it and choose to do that in the Dominican Republic. It's interesting that in the United States, we had a clear differentiation, black-white, so that you have, in fact, people in Dominican Republic or in Brazil who might be considered mixed or mulatto. We didn't deal with those. The whole category of black-white was very clear. And these are people are interested also in their ancestry. So, I did my DNA. I found out that I'm, 77% African, what percent European, what percent Native American. This makes me the person I am. So all the different strands that went into making me, Linda, the person I am, it's meaningful to me on a personal level and on a societal level. One has to be certain of where you are in Virginia. What's my root? So if I can go, it's not to say that one is undermining one or the other, but it's in fact coming closer together and accepting that, yes, there are some people who have remained all Europeans. ancestry. They're Americans. There are some people who are mixed. They're Americans. There are some people who are more visibly African. They are also Americans. So the American story is a story of people coming together. That's, for me, how I teach my class, how I understand America. It's becoming American. And we all these different strands, went into becoming American.
Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, are we teaching our students today about 1619 and about how all of these groups, as Dr. Heywood said, we're all, mixed together and we're all Americans? Are we teaching it that way?
I don't know that we're teaching it that way because we're kind of under the umbrella of the SOL, the standards of learning that are a little bit more quantitative oriented as opposed to qualitatively oriented. What happened here? What happened there? All the multiple choice questions that make up, what each group has considered to be part of the American story. But our intent is to ensure that we begin a conversation that is much more inclusive, that's much more updated to where scholarship is. Because a lot of the scholarship that went into pulling together the SOL is really in some ways wedded to the past and to more traditional approaches to looking at history. But history has many lenses. It's not just one lens. It's not just one point of view. What did these other groups think of the Europeans coming to this country? Let's include their voice. I know that the SOLs have included here in Virginia the Native American history, but still in limited ways. And I think that there's much more room for expansion. And as we expand, then we become more relevant because we've always been, especially since the early arrival of here in this country, the early arrival of the English, we've always been a multicultural society. As soon as people began arriving, they began mixing with each other, whether it's genetic mixing or whether it's cultural mixing. And so it's time that we change the narrative to some degree to a much more historically accurate narrative that's inclusive as opposed to telling a more European narrative.
We've only got a few minutes left in the conversation, and we have a question on Facebook. They want to know about how you all feel about the term African American, since we're made up of so many different cultures, groups. So I throw that out to the group, whoever wants to answer it.
Well, I will answer it. For instance, I'm from the Caribbean, so some might call me Caribbean American. I've been here since 1969. But when I came here, I came to America, and I saw it when I became a citizen. I saw myself as American because I see in America all the different elements that make up America. So even though I teach African American history, as I tell my students, I said, it's American history. It's just looking at American history through a different lenses, right? So that we have to, it's not taken out from American history. It is, in fact, enriching American history. So I see, the study or the identification of American as the thing. I'm American. That's what, for me, my students should come out with, whether it's black students, mixed students, Native American, or European students, and I have all. They come out as being, I am really part of this American story.
You also have to consider that if for someone to self-identify and say they're African American, they are saying something about how they view themselves. And so people are still in the process of trying to decide who they really want to be and how they want to identify themselves. Society used to have structure and rules saying, this is how we're going to identify you. But now people have much more freedom and liberty to self-identify. And I think that you'll find that as we are getting more and more into the 21st century, that some of these terms will really become archaic. Right. And they will transform as we transform and begin to identify ourselves in very different ways.
Cassandra, I'd like to ask you one real quick question, and we've got about a minute left in the discussion, but what is a ritual of remembrance ceremony? I saw that that's something that's going to happen at the conference.
Yes, it's going to be on Saturday at the end of the conference. We wanted to make sure, and we have the Sankofa Project that's a part of this, that's helping to really lead this. We wanted to make sure that we plug into something that's going on internationally, and that is throughout the world, wherever there was an African diaspora, or whether it's the receiving end or the departure end, that we have these ceremonies that really speak to remembering that particular past and reconnecting with our ancestors.
Well, I wish you all, I'm sorry I got to cut you off, but we're just about out of time. And I want to invite people again to go to Norfolk State University if you want more interested in continuing this conversation. The conference is today and tomorrow. And I want to thank Dr. Linda Heywood and Dr. John Thornton, both professors of history at Boston University, and also our own Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, history professor at Norfolk State University. Thanks so much for joining us today with the conversation. And we'll be right back. And welcome back. Playwright August Wilson was a master of depicting African-American life in the 20th century. His Pulitzer Prize-winning Fences could very well be the best-loved chapter of his 10-play cycle. Our Lisa Godley recently sat down with some of the actors who'll soon bring this incredible production to life for the Virginia Stage Company.
Fences is the story of a family struggling to remain close in the midst of tribulation.
I need you to help me clean out these cupboards.
I ain't quitting the team. I don't care what Papa say.
I'll talk to him when he gets back. Had to go see about your Uncle Gabe. Police done arrested him, say he was disturbing the peace. He'll be back directly. Come on, I need you to help me clean out the top of these cupboards.
It's playwright August Wilson's look at life for a black family in the 1950s. The patriarch is Troy Maxson, played by Keith Randolph Smith, who was a member of the Broadway cast of Fences in 2010. So I asked him to give us a brief description of his character.
Troy is a garbage collector. He's 53 years old, lives in Pittsburgh, married, has a wife, Rose, played by Tony Patano, and a son who's 17, played by Jonathan Majors, and then he has another son from a previous marriage, Lyons. That's Charlie Hudson III. And by the end of the play, he has a new child in a relationship outside of his wife.
Some people build fences to keep people out. Other people build fences to keep people there. Rose, she wants to hold on to y'all. She loves you.
I know it. I don't need nobody to tell me my wife loves me. Corey, go in the house and see if you can find that other salt. What's that? I said find it. Look forward to you find it.
Rose is Troy's wife. She's played by Tony Patano, who has earned rave reviews for her role in the Showtime series Weeds, which just concluded its 8th and final season last week. Tony says she relates to the character Rose through her strength.
As black women in this country, you know, we all had a hand in raising everyone in the communities, white, black, but there's always a strength. Rose has a different kind of strength, like I said, more so than the kind of characters I normally play, who are very fiercely independent and I can do it on my own. You know, she has actively made a choice to partner with a man and be a support for him and her family.
The director for the Virginia Stage Company's production of Fences is Newport News native Derek Sanders. Derek says he loves it when he can return home with a production. He says he was bitten by the theater bug when he was a student at Warwick High School. He says he did do some acting, but he seemed to naturally have a director's ear and eye. His ability to pull what he needed from the actors was obvious during a recent rehearsal in downtown Norfolk.
Experiencing life right now, in the moment. Right? So So they're speaking from their core all the time.
Cast member Rodney Suter also has ties to Hampton Roads. Suter, a local radio personality, runs a conservative talk radio station. But for the next 2 weeks, he'll play Troy Maxon's best friend, Jim Bono.
You only build a little teeny old fence. Get you some soft pine wood. That's all you need.
I know what I'm doing. This is outside wood. You put pine wood inside the house. Pine wood is inside wood. This here is outside wood. Now you tell me what the fence is going to be.
Hoping that they get to love this character. Because, at the start of a show, when the show first starts, it seems like you always pick a character to identify with. And we got a wide array of characters here, so hopefully they'll identify with Jim Bono. He's the everyman of the show.
The Pulitzer Prize-winning Fences will open the Virginia Stage Company's 34th season. Area teachers and educators are invited to attend the Sunday, September 23rd dress rehearsal free with ID and advanced reservation.
What you mean?
For Another View, I'm Lisa Godley.
The Virginia Stage Company's production of Fences runs September 25th through October 14th at the Wells Theater in downtown Norfolk. Time now for things to view and do in Hampton Roads.
You will be my Saturday love.
Young ladies who are high school sophomores and juniors are invited to participate in the Jabberwock 2013, a debutante-style scholarship pageant presented by the Chesapeake, Virginia Beach Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. You are invited to attend a special red and white tea this coming Sunday, September 23rd at 2:30 at the Chesapeake Central Library on Cedar Road. You must RSVP today by email jabberwock2013@gmail.com. The Portsmouth School Board will hold a public hearing on the proposed Minority and Women Business Enterprise Policy on Thursday, September 27th at 7 p.m. in the City Council Chamber on Crawford Street in Portsmouth. Come let your voice be heard on this important policy. Norfolk State University's Women's Empowerment Development Center presents Wednesday's Woman, an empowerment circle discussing issues of interest to women. It's every Wednesday from 6 until 7:30 at the NSU Police Station. The next session is Wednesday, September 26th. Call 823-2650 to find out more. Making plans to attend college, the Tidewater chapter of North Carolina A&T State University Alumni Association is sponsoring a bus trip to A&T for University Day on Saturday, October 13th. There is a cost and you must register by Friday, September 28th. Seating is limited. Call 515-3571 for details. The Fort Monroe Authority, along with consultant Sasaki Associates Incorporated, is holding public meetings on the Fort Monroe Master Plan. There are 2 meetings, Thursday, September 27th from 6 until 8:30 and Friday, September 28th from 9:30 a.m. until noon. Both meetings will be held at the Babe Reeds Conference Center, Fenwick Road on Fort Monroe. The meeting is free and open to the public. Call 251-2754 with questions. These and other events are on our website, anotherviewradio.org. You can also find podcasts of all of our shows, and you can sign up for our e-newsletter, a once-a-week reminder of upcoming shows. Next week, we'll examine issues facing women from a global and local perspective as part of a major documentary initiative called Half the Sky. For producer Lisa Godley, audio engineer Perry Smith, Eric Moore, who answered the phones, I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a fantastic weekend, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.